everyone for joining us today. We have another amazing guest with us. We have Marc Grandia. And so Marc, he's a 4-star level eventer, and he's competing internationally on the 3 and 4-star levels. He's also an ICP level 3 instructor, and he even designs cross-country courses. So he, most recently, he's had success at the 3 and 4th, earning 3rd and 4th place at a 4-star level show, or 2 shows, with one of the horses from Team Rebecca, Team Rebecca's horse. It's Campari FFF. So he's been out and about, and he's been working, and he's doing a lot of amazing things with his horses. And we'd love to hear more about it. So thank you so much, Marc. Thanks for joining us today. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. You're in Washington right now, or are you traveling as well?
I'm at home. Yeah, Galway last weekend was our last big show of the year, so we're home for the next few.
Oh, that's awesome. So it's like that was the home stretch, and now you get to stay home for a while.
Yes, it is definitely our downtime this part of the year.
Oh, awesome. Yeah, I mean, I am at, because like we're a little spoiled with we don't really have weather in Southern California, so it's like, oh yeah, there's snow and stuff. So I'm originally from Colorado, so I do know about, like we used to have snow and stuff, so I do miss the weather and changes in weather. So, but sometimes I forget.
Lots of
there's snow out there. Sorry. Oh my goodness. So Marc, thank you so much for joining us. So you do quite a bit. So not only are you competing, but you're actually involved in like designing the courses, which I think that is so fascinating. So can you tell us a little bit about how in the world are you designing these courses?
Oh boy. Which part? I mean, it started for me because I was doing some building. So I was the farm that I was working at had an event, and every summer we'd have to build cross-country jumps, and I found that really fascinating, interesting. And then it just sort of grew from there. I got the opportunity to apprentice with some really good designers, and that sort of it's very interesting for me, and it's also a nice little bonus to add to my business. Instead of just riding or training, I've got other skills that I can market. So it's very helpful.
Yeah, and so I think that's just like so fascinating that you're actually designing them. So it's like, are you basing it like a specific wood, or like the height, and like what goes into? I mean, and like probably, I don't know. I'm really curious to hear more about that. Like, just how are you designing these courses? They're so cool.
Let's say if I were to get just a blank piece of land, you sort of start with you have to start with the whole flow, right? As a cross-country designer, you're the first official on course for any event, and you're there for the longest. So you're actually responsible for the layout of the whole property, not just the cross-country course. That includes emergency access and warm-up arenas and where the dressage is going to be and all of those things. A lot of people don't understand that. So you've got to take a whole, overview perspective of the property and say what's going to make the most sense for competitors, down to where the manure pits are going to be and how they're going to get rid of it. Those kind of things are all fall under your, definitely the course designer has to think about those things. And then you get to look at the cross-country course, and you want to have a flow on a cross-country course, right? A beginning, a middle, and an end, sort of a warm-up, and then it can get a little bit tougher. And then the end is finishing and keeping everybody safe and making sure the riders that are still riding well get to finish well. So you've got to think a little bit about that. How does the property lay to the beginning and middle of the end? Where are the interesting terrain features? That's the part that's really fun for me. Like where's the ground? What part of this hill or what part of this property looks like it'd be really fun to gallop a horse on? And then what jumps fit there, and what would be challenging, and what would make sense to a horse. And I mean, when you really do it from the very beginning, you get to think about where you want a water jump, and where do you want the banks, and where do you want the ditches, and what makes the most sense for a coffin. And it's just, you get to be very creative. It's mostly, for me, based on what would be fun to ride. What would I want to ride right here in this place if I got to dream up anything?
That is so cool. Like, talk about creative work you can do with like horseback riding, and then integrating it into just workmanship of like landscaping. So that is amazing. Yeah. And do you design like the colors and things like that, like the patterns on the jumps too, or is that someone else who kind of decides to make it
I
more.
will admit that is not my strong suit. I am not a color coordinated kind of guy. So I for horses, it's important to have contrast more than the actual particular colors because they don't see a lot of those colors. So contrast is really important so they can see the difference in the heights and the spreads and things. Those I'll make sure are important, but I love it when I go to an event where somebody wants to take over the themes, if you will.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting because yeah, of course the colors, it's really important in the jumps. It makes it more difficult or less difficult depending on the coloring and that aspect too. So I just have like just a side question too. So that in a lot of eventing courses they have like in like Rolex and then even in Galway they have the duck, like the one jump in the water and it's a duck. Is that a common one that's like, because it's very unique, but there's this wooden jump that's like a duck. Like, is that?
And it looks very much like a duck too, doesn't it?
Yeah.
They've gotten really good at those things. So yes, Rolex has two ducks, I think, and they might have been the first one. I can't remember who first did a duck, but whoever did it, it was a great idea, and everyone's copied them since. It's just a carving, and pretty much any good course builder with a chainsaw can carve a duck now.
Like, oh, I can carve a duck. Oh, he's good. So I just noticed that. I just didn't know. I'm like, is there like some sort of like you have to have a duck or something like in your like,
no, ducks are just. I think they're noticeable, but they're also pretty easy when it comes down to carving.
I see. Okay.
Because they're sort of shaped like a log, right? And you start with a log to carve a duck, and then you just have the head coming out of there.
Right. You just kind of add on to it and stuff. So that's kind of.
We've got an alligator at Twin Rivers. They've got fish at Rolex, like really beautiful trout. At Rebecca Farm. There's a sea monster at Rebecca Farm. There's dinosaurs. I mean, there's a bit of everything out there.
Yeah. It's very creative. It's so cool. I think that is a really cool thing that you do. Like that's pretty unique that you design the courses like that and get to see all that.
It's a really fun aspect of it, definitely. And it's made me a better rider and a better trainer, really.
Oh, I'm sure, because then you know exactly like why the course is laid out the way it is and how it's helping them utilize the area and then how it's supposed to challenge the horse. And yeah, I think that's really cool. That's why I wanted definitely to mention that, because I was like, well, I mean, I can see like even like the spacing, like because you have to know like the pace and for the jump and all that too. So that's really cool. Do you base it on that? Like how, I bet you do a lot of that design too, like to know like how many strides it takes to get to the next one and all that business safely and
yeah, definitely. So there's a lot that goes into that. For each level, right? There's not only strides between the jumps, but also strides out of a turn. So however many strides a horse and rider gets a chance to see a particular jump or combination, and the further you go up the levels, the fewer strides they get. That means that the horses have to be quicker to recognize what's in front of them. And then there's also stride length, right? Because it varies. It's very different all the way up the levels. And at the lower levels, we sort of base it on a 12-foot stride. But when you get further and further up the levels, you can change the distance between the jumps and make the riders have to answer that problem, meaning they've got to adjust the stride length of the horses to fit a certain number of strides in there. And sometimes there can be different, one horse might do 4 strides and one horse might do 5. You've got to know your horse's strengths and weaknesses and know whether or not they can answer that question.
Yeah. And it's also, I've seen it a couple times where, if you know your horse's, strengths and weaknesses, they might, the main route of the course people follow, but I've seen people just cut areas where it's like, they're not like, they just want to go to the next jump and they cut things differently, but they're still going, like continuing the correct route. I just think that's interesting how, like how the routes go and like that too.
You have to think about that a lot. In California, it's a bit different because you have to stay on the prepared footing because everything else is a bit, dangerous. But when you're running on grass or some of these areas, all you really have to do is go through the flag as a horse and rider combination, right? So that actually leaves a lot of leeway, and you can pick any track between the fences that you'd like to make it easier for your horse. If you can find a better one, then go on a shorter one.
Yeah. And I think that's a big part of creativity too. So Well, I'm just stepping back from that because I think that is so fascinating. But I would love to hear more about like you and Campari. So that's like a client's horse of yours, is that right?
Yeah, the Team Rebecca is an organization that was set up by Rebecca Broussard
Okay.
before she passed, and it was to support riders in their competition goals. So they're not a typical client. They don't pay me to teach them, but they pay his expenses, and I get the opportunity to go and compete him to pursue my goals.
Yeah, that's awesome. So Campari clearly, I mean, is at a high level of doing 3 and 4 star events. And so, like, how are you deciding like when to level up your horse? Like, so Campari had to start somewhere, right? So when did you decide to have Campari go to that level?
I mean, we sort of lay out an ideal plan for years in advance. I'm thinking 2 years in advance right now. What can I do? And then there's realistically what is going to happen depending on what has happened. His plans changed a lot of times because I tried to hurry him along when he was young, and he wasn't the right thing, so we had to back off. But this year, I would say it was at the end of, and it was this time last year when I made the plan for this year, and we were pretty well able to stick to it as far as which events to try to target and when to level up and where to go.
Okay, so yeah, it just depends on the situation and like moving forward from there. What is Campari's background? Where like the breeding? I think I have it here. So Campari, so he's a Holsteiner, is that right?
He is, yep. He was bred at a farm in Gig Harbor, Washington, so pretty local here to me. He has a half brother who, with Maya Black, went to Rolex, and I think they were second at Rolex the year that they competed there, which is pretty impressive
Ah,
for
okay.
any. I mean, it's really I was very impressive for any horse, and so there's definitely a lot of eventing blood in his background. He was bought by a client of mine actually for their daughter, and she had a lot of trouble with him. He was because he was difficult, very athletic and a bit wild, and he was 5 at the time, I think.
Mhm.
So I had him in training because they were struggling with him, and then ended up buying him from them.
I see. And I think it's really interesting how you're saying like it was difficult to work with. Just a side
Yeah,
note, like from my background, I know like a lot of race horses. Sometimes those are like the best race horses because they have so much drive and it's hard to like keep it's just their personality. So if they're
yeah,
unruly and things like that, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's like they have a lot of like passion and drive. And so a
yeah.
lot of times people pick horses based on like how unruly they are. Like I think it's kind of funny. But so
It's silly to put it that way, but you're right. They do, and it's certainly not something that you count against them because everyone always says the most difficult ones or the best ones are the most difficult, and that is consistent throughout the sports, I think.
yeah.
Now, why that's the case is a whole other question, but it definitely there is some. It's important to remember that, and especially in those times when you're like, "Why am I doing that?" It's not fun anymore.
We're like on the back of a dragon.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think it's in those moments like where it's a horse that's very strong-willed, to have that great relationship with them where you guys can work as a team to accomplish things like getting like third and fourth place at these high-level 4 star events. So it's like, for example, like with Campari, like what would a normal day look like when you're working with Campari, like when you're getting ready for shows and things like that?
Right now things are a little bit easier for him because this is downtime, but he's still working lightly. In the middle of the season, let's say so sort of 3 weeks away from a show, right? A normal day, he goes out in the morning and does a light lunge, and that's mostly so actually we can start back even further than that. He gets turned out all night long. So he goes out at 5 o'clock at night and he comes in at 7 o'clock the next morning. Comes in, he gets to eat his breakfast. He's on a really particular high fat, low sugar diet, which is best for him and his muscles and his training. He's a quiet horse, like around the barn, but he's very overactive and energy to try to ride. So we always take him out in the morning and let him lunge and buck and just sort of loose and very little structure to it, but let him burn off his extra energy like a kid with ADD a little bit. because he has a lot of extra energy, which is part of the reason I really like him.
Right.
So yeah, he gets to go out and lunge in the morning, and I try to do that, but I don't always get to. Sometimes my groom does that, and anyway, so that's the morning, and then we'll go out sometime either later in the morning or early in the afternoon and ride, depending on what we're doing for the day. If it's a dressage ride or a jumping ride, those look a little bit different. But definitely, when we're in the middle of the season, it's a minimum of an hour, hour and a half on his back, just walking and then training and then walking again, because getting the steps in for fitness, and just for him, he's just moving, right? And for us, just spending time together and sort of getting to know him. And yeah, anyway, that's a normal day. He gets feed
Yeah.
in the evening and he goes back out into his paddock.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting too. So just time with your horse. You said like an hour and a half, just moving him and working with him and just doing different exercises together. Are you doing any kind of groundwork with him for like dressage or anything like that? I'm just curious.
Yes. So I do a lot of groundwork when I start the young horses. I do like to start my horses from from the very beginning. I find it easier to go all the way through if I've started them. So we do lots of groundwork then when they're 3 and they're 4, or if we're struggling with something. Now he doesn't do as much. We have done a little bit of groundwork this year, trying to get extra collection and dressage and that kind of thing. So that would be me riding and then somebody else on the ground. But he's very suspicious and very careful, and he figures that out pretty quick that he doesn't like that.
Oh, he's suspicious. What are you humans
He's
up
very
to?
yeah, exactly. It used to be actually even now still. It used to be that I couldn't even when I'm show jumping, nobody could even stand next to the jump, because then he would be so worried about what that person was doing and not as worried about the jumping.
Oh,
So when I go in the ring now, I always tell the ring crew, I'm like, okay, don't make any sudden movements. Just stand still while I'm out here. Remember, knock a rail down. Don't run and get it. Just wait.
yeah, because
he notices those things.
Yeah, he's highly sensitive to those. Okay, interesting. So, and how old is he now? He's I think you just mentioned it.
He's 9 this year.
9. Okay. Wow. So you guys have accomplished a lot. And I mean, so you said you started working on the ground when he was younger and things like that, and just every now and then seldomly work him, for situations like overcoming some obstacles and stuff. But I think that's really interesting. So
Thanks. Yeah, pretty fun.
So when you're writing him and you were having a difficult situation, kind of like you said, like getting on groundwork and things like that, but say it's a new obstacle, like literally an obstacle like in front of him, how are you helping him overcome those that challenge and working together and overcoming that?
That is a really good question. So I can think of one example, but it's not. We really struggled with from the time he was about 6 to even really this year with open oxers on cross country, which are, as you can imagine, just logs and space in between. And we also have open corners that we have to jump, and those are difficult, and they cause us a bit of problem. And in those cases, it was sort of going. I mean, those are hard to break down into simpler exercises, right? But so in general, when horses struggling with something, we try to take it down to as simple as possible, right? Take it back to something that they understand and build from there, because that's all we ever do when we're training horses. If you want to teach them something complex in dressage, you got to start with something simple, and then that goes from the first time you get on their back, right? You teach them to steer, you teach them to move away from the leg, you start doing combinations of those things to then teach them fancier and fancier movements, and it's the same in the jumping. So if we're talking about something that he's not sure of, which, gosh, it seems so silly now because he's so good at it, he just handles things now, right? But you just take it back to its most simple form. This year, I was really very worried about at Rebecca Farm, the coffin there. It's a very difficult coffin. He's never seen anything like that. So in preparation for that event, I have some super simple cross-country jumps that I have, and I have a portable ditch, if you will. It's a fake ditch, so it's just a black tarp in the middle of and an outline, because the horses can't tell, right? It's dark, so it looks like a hole, so they jump over it, right? So we had that out. I had it out in my cross-country field, and I, we jump it and make sure that he's good with it, and then move it into a shorter and shorter distance, simulating the steepness of the hill by bringing it closer and closer to the backside of the first log. And these are little jumps for him, right? They're 2 foot 211. The log coming in, and the ditch is only 3 foot across, which again, it's really small for him. But using the smaller stuff and then shortening up the distance so that he has to think a lot quicker.
Right.
To make him basically to once he understands the elements, then making it happen faster for him.
Right. And
so that he can get comfortable.
Yeah.
With the open oxers, because that was a real problem for us. It was a real problem for us coming all the way along open oxers and open corners, and he's really good at it now. Finally this year, it was finding a way to approach the question, right? So I'll go back to an event last spring when I moved him up to the 3-star level for the first time. I fell off because I went out and I really wanted to ride bold and ride aggressive and teach the horse that he had to go forward, and all that made him do was jump harder and spook. Like he was like, "Whoa, what are we worried about? Why are we riding so aggressively? Like what?" So then he got more and more suspicious, and eventually jumped into the water and just jumped so hard I landed and sprung right off his back.
Oh wow!
So worried about stuff, right?
Yeah.
So I had to change my strategy from there. If he's worried about something, I can't just get more aggressive with his horse, because that makes him like suspicious, right? He's very much going to take care.
So why are we changing it up, kind of thing?
Yeah, exactly. What's different here, right? And that's how horses survive in the wild. They notice differences. So anyway, it was very much more than making it smooth. Like if I'm worried about something, or if I think he's going to be worried about something, don't take that and try to change what I'm doing. Just it's hard to describe, but basically, ride with a little bit more leg, change the balance a little bit more, and be ready to react if he reacts, but not in changing something preemptively.
Preemptively, yeah.
It's made him more suspicious, and he's very suspicious.
What a great horse to learn all this stuff with. You know what I mean? Like he's such a high caliber horse, and you can experience all of these things. So you learn so much more riding a horse that's that sensitive and can share, tell you how they think. I think that's really, really quite, that's like a really nice gift that he can give you. It's like some people who ride, it's hard, they don't have that relationship with their horse necessarily, because then maybe it's routine of riding and things like that. But the fact that you can even understand those small little details shows that you have such a great relationship with him. So you can understand those small things, that little tweaks. And so, okay, well, I'm just not going to put so much pressure on it, and he'll think it through normally. And you're just going to do your routines. You're practicing the way you're going to do it in competition, so that he knows okay, well, and this is exactly how we practiced it. It's just the jump might be higher or something, but the mental game is there. So I think that's really fascinating.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, thank you. He's been really great to be able to work with.
Yeah. Yeah. And so Campari, is he your main horse, or do you have other horses client horses and things, or?
Yeah, he's my top level horse, but I do have others. I've got a couple of horses from Sunsprite Warm Bloods down there in Southern California. So they're not Warm Bloods anymore. Sunsprite. Anyway, they're down there in Southern California, and those are both very, very nice horses. And then I've got a couple others as well. One mare that we decided to breed this year instead of competing her. She's owned by a syndicate, so we'll have a baby on the ground next spring, which will be fun. And then I have a baby horse as well, owned by the same syndicate. So I've got enough to do here.
Yeah. Oh, that's awesome. So you have quite an array, just different things to keep you interested and active with different, levels of horses. So that's really cool.
Yeah. And that's very intentional. We decided, my wife and I, about 2-3 years ago, maybe, that we, instead of trying to buy, 5-year-old horses, which is when you know whether or not they're going to be good, right? You buy a 5-year-old and they either show a lot of talent or they don't, and they sort of show they've developed, right? They're not fully trained, but they're developed, but they're more expensive too. So we decided, instead of buying sort of 5-year-olds and putting them to competing, we wanted to buy 2- and 3-year-olds. and let them grow up, and then taking a little bit more risk, but you're spending less money, and then you get to do the beginning part of the work
Right.
with
You
them.
can
You
be
get to
with them
start
from the
and you get to
beginning.
figure out who they're going to be, and if they're not nice enough to go to the upper levels, then they're going to be well trained quality horses that we can then move on to another job.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, for sure. So, I mean, just having them from the beginning, there's so many benefits of starting with them, and then
Yeah.
moving them through, so they already understand what you're going to ask for them in the future. But then that's okay. Sometimes if it's a horse that is not showing like all they like drive in that sport, it's okay to like find a good home for them that would work really well, and they would be happy in that, and just, whatever sport they decide to go into as well. So, do you rehome them for, having them go into their regular, like whatever sport they are good at?
Yeah, I mean, we don't do a lot of crossing into different sports just because you have to have lots of relationships with people in other sports. We do into jumping and into dressage certainly, but it's whatever they're going to be good at, right? And a horse that is well trained and has some athletic ability is going to be good at the lower levels in anything that they
Right.
want to do, right? A horse that's going to be a good barrel racer isn't going to be a top level event horse, but they could certainly do lower level eventing and vice versa, right? Because they can understand the job, and they're athletic and they're balanced, and really understanding the job is a big part of it, right? So, yeah, we definitely, if they're not suited for the upper level stuff, we're going to find them to do the job that's going to be best for them.
Right. Okay. So yeah, understandable too. And it's all that horse is now helping someone else figure out, like how to on the lower levels for eventing and other sports in that
Right.
sense too. So even though the horse is not feeling passionate in that sport necessarily, doesn't mean you can't rehome them to help someone else and they're happy in that situation. So I think that's really cool that you start them out young though, to see if you can bring them in right away and, just raise them in that environment. So that's really cool. So I was
It's great. You know everything about them, right? You know a lot from the very beginning. You know what they've struggled with, what they've done really well from the very beginning. So it's very helpful.
right, and like how they flourish, and you can see their like just their I guess you can say like their movements in the beginning, like what they're already good at, and
Yep,
then you can just amplify
yep,
that as they get older. So
right.
huge benefits of
Absolutely.
starting younger. Yeah. So I was going to ask you about, so this is a question I usually ask. It's like, so going back, if you could share like one thing that like you didn't know that you know now that really just changed, it's a kind of a big question, but that changed like,
Yeah, one
I
thing.
wish I knew this, like when I first started, like, and it's like a game changer. Like, is there any like big nugget that you could share with people who are just wanting to, do more competition or just build a better relationship with their animals?
Yes. There's one big nugget is hard to put it into perspective because there's so many that it comes out to be so many little things, right?
Right.
We tend to think that dressage training or jumping training is something big and complex, but really at the end of the day, teaching a horse these tricks, if you will, is no different than teaching your dog tricks. They learn in a certain way, and understanding the horse's learning is probably the thing that I wish that I had more when I was younger, right? Because it would have saved me a lot of difficulty, and it would have saved a lot of horses a lot of difficulty and a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety and a lot of bad dressage tests. Because if tension, bucking, rearing, all those things come out of a horse not understanding what's being asked of them, and that's it. So you've got to figure out the best way to explain to them what it is that you want, and then go from there. And it's so much faster, and it's so much happier. Everyone's happier when you're not asking too much, and you're being really clear with them, and you're explaining to them in terms that they understand. In terms of pressure and release and moving their feet. And yeah, I wish that I had better understood how horses learn and how horses see things when I was younger, because it would have saved a lot of heartache.
Yeah, I mean, just the basics of just understanding of like how are they perceiving what we're asking of them. Like I totally hear you on that. So it's like that, like the basics, just like if you get that concept down, it's like like you said, just so much smoother. Like you can just go, then any situation you're in, you can just go back to like, okay, well, how am I going to share this with my horse for him to understand it? Then you can just go back to the basics and it's all simplified. So I totally hear you on that. I mean, that's like gold right there. Like just the basics. Like if you can understand the basics with your horse, like you can really accomplish pretty much anything. I mean, like you said, you're at the 4-star level, and just getting from there, you have to, like you said, like with your any kind of complication that you had with your horse, you break it, simplify it for him to understand it better, and just knowing
Yeah.
that, like, it's just so much easier. And like you said, like he understands it so well now. Well, that's because you have a great relationship with him and you know how to present questions to him. So I think that is like a huge takeaway from this. So yeah, so Mark, thank you so much for joining us. Those are huge tips. And yeah, I just really appreciate your time sharing it with us. It's really nice that you are open to sharing, like tips and helping people build better relationships with their animals too. So I really appreciate your time today.
Well, thank you too, and I'd like to acknowledge you for doing this. It's not that there's a deficit in our sport a little bit, especially at the upper levels, of people who are still enjoying this, and putting their horse first and their sport second. I think that's a great title. We all start to because we love horses, and then somewhere along the lines we get a little too competitive, or it's financially straining. There's all these extra pressures that we put on our horses that they don't understand. So you have to. I just would like to acknowledge you for putting this information out there, and trying to show people that yeah, we're very lucky. We're very lucky to be able to do that.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. I appreciate it. And I really enjoy also just sharing and just helping people build that relationship with their animals. And like just having experts like you come on, it just brings a whole nother level of just like, it's out there in the world that people like the value. And I just really appreciate you sharing it. So thank you for coming. So we'll end on that note, Mark. Well, yeah, thank you so much, and we'll be talking soon.
Sounds great. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you.
Bye.